On BBC Two, Joe Coburn talks politics.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, former Brexit Party MEP Claire Fox, the Daily Telegraph's Christopher Hope, former Home Secretary Amber Rudd and Lib Dem leader Ed Davey. Today,
we've come so far, we mustn't blow it now.
Tears before Christmas. Much of the southeast of England goes into Tier 3. Very few areas go down a tier.
Even if sometimes results are coming later than we might have wanted, I know that we will be doing everything in order to secure a good free trade agreement.
But will a deal really founder over fish? The courts won't stand in the way of a third runway at Heathrow, but will the Prime Minister?
I will join you, I will lie down with you in front of those bulldozers.
More of that later, but let's start with the Brexit negotiations for a free trade deal at the end of the transition period. We're going to start by showing you this tweet from Tony Connolly, who is RTE's Europe editor. Update on where we're at in the Brexit negotiations, helpfully. While both sides have a way to go, on the level playing field, or state aid, this would be competition rules, there is a landing zone in sight. On fisheries, he says, both sides say that is very difficult. Claire, should the Brexit deal live or die over fish?
It's not over fish. It's one of the symbolically important parts of this whole discussion.
Over fish?
Over control of waters. That's what it's about. And also for coastal communities, they're part of that constituency that felt that they had been ignored, sold out, generally done badly under the EU. And so, you know, people sort of make these kind of snidey comments. You know, we in the city don't understand what all this fish nonsense is about. Well, the fact that they don't understand it is exactly the problem.
All right.
So consequently, it's not about whether the deal flounders over fish. The control of waters is about sovereignty, and doing a deal that betrays sovereignty just for a trade deal, when Brexit was never just about trade deals, it's important that that bit is not used in some glib, flippant way.
Right, well, I'm going to use that glib phrase again, Amber, for the purposes of the start of this programme to clear our throats, is should the Brexit deal live or die over fish and control of our waters, then?
Fish has an important place in the negotiations. A lot of people did feel that they voted for Brexit in order to, as Claire said, have independent control of the waters. And it became a hugely significant and symbolic part of Brexit. And a lot of the Brexit campaign was about symbolism, about sovereignty, rather than about the harsh reality of the economics of life. So I do think it's going to continue to have an important part in the negotiations, but I don't think it will stop it. Ultimately, I think both sides, the EU and even Macron and the UK, will be able to come to an agreement because it'll be about some sort of compromise over a period of years. And quite frankly, that will suit the UK because however much of our fishing waters we reclaim, we're not ready to fish that amount all over again. So we're going to need a period of a few years. So I'm confident that it won't be the mechanism that will stop a deal taking place. OK,
well, we've heard a bit about the symbolism and how important it was in terms of that referendum. But Ed Davey, in economic terms, fishing accounts for 0.02% of UK GDP, according to the Office for National Statistics. So should that Brexit deal live or die over fish?
Well, Joe, I agree with Amber. I don't think it will do. But you're right to talk about the economy, because our economy is on its knees. We've got the deepest recession for 300 years. And my concern is that all we're hearing is that the deal is going to be a very threadbare deal if we get one. And frankly, a bad deal or a no deal would be really reckless at this time of massive recession, unemployment rocketing. And I don't think any responsible Prime Minister should countenance either.
Chris, can you give us any more intelligence in terms of what Tony Connolly was saying, that he thinks there is movement on that sort of unfair playing field as the EU sees it, potentially, or is it about fish?
I was talking to a senior Brexiteer today. The big issue they've got is this idea of non-regression, so that we can't weaken any EU standards here. This EU red tape, a big issue, which has dominated Claire's life for a long time, and also Brexiteers. So whether they can get a degree of, that's the point of Brexit, to have control over the rules we have here. On fish, one MP told me yesterday that fishing, that Harrods, the shop, has a bigger turnover than fish in terms of value to this country. And so we are getting quite het up about quite a small part. It will grow, though, over years. And I think Amber's right. There will be a degree of almost a transition period. The problem has been the EU has combined both sovereignty with the fish in the water. The fish in the water is subject to trade deals. The sovereignty is a UN issue.
All right. Well, Amber, did you think, when you were in government, that actually we'd be at this stage just literally weeks away from the end of the transition period?
No, I didn't. That's why I continually fought for having a Brexit under Theresa May that would be better for the economy. Under Theresa May, we were trying to have a sort of what was sort of called a soft Brexit rather than a hard Brexit. And now the decision is between a hard Brexit or no Brexit at all. Both of them are bad for the economy, but both of them will deliver some improvement in sovereignty. That is the price of Brexit. It makes me weep for the cost that we are paying to businesses and therefore to people's employment, particularly at a time when the country, like most countries, is being so adversely affected by COVID. But I do hope that the government does achieve a deal in the end, because that will be better than leaving without a deal at all. And it's not just about jobs. You know, as a former Home Secretary, I'm very concerned about the security implications of leaving without a deal.
Right. So in your mind, no deal is worse than any deal?
Completely. Imagine leaving the EU without a deal, with none of those arrangements of the databases that keep this country safe, keep individual citizens in this country safe. It would just be so irresponsible.
Right. I mean, Ed Davey, it's your fault. As Amber said, you could have accepted a softer Brexit and then we wouldn't be in this position.
Liberal Democrats have led the fight against Brexit. I think people know that. We believe it's in our country's long-term interest to be close to our European neighbours and to trade, and not least now with the absolute imperative to protect people's jobs. And let's remember, Liberal Democrats led the fight against no deal. In my view, no deal will always be avoidable if the Prime Minister acts responsibly. If the Prime Minister decides to push no deal in whatever circumstances, it goes on his head. I just think that our country, in the economic crisis that it finds itself in, needs a good deal. And I really, really worry that the deal that they're talking about is going to be so bad, it's going to wrap up our businesses in red tape, and it will make the economic crisis that we're in even deeper.
Right. I mean, Amber, have you ever talked to people like Ed Davey, though, on that side of the argument and said, you know what, you should have backed Theresa May's deal?
Oh, you bet, you bet. I mean, I think it's very, very sad that the Lib Dems, and more importantly, perhaps Labour, who had, let's face it, far more MPs and could have really made a difference, chose not to back a deal. And worse than that, they frustrated, Keir Starmer particularly, frustrated the possibility of having a deal that the Conservative that was running the country and Labour could support as well. And many Labour MPs, some of whom are no longer in Parliament, express their regret now. I mean, the Lib Dems' position, as far as I understand it, is that they wouldn't support any deal, and they continue to have that position. And I mean, that just means we've ended up with no deal. But there's lots of people who are responsible for where we are now. But the fact that the last Parliament that I was in was unable to resolve and do a deal that would have been better for the economy, I think is really a sad outcome.
Well, listen, Amber, you and I have agreed on the fact that Brexit is bad for our country, and you were very good in leading the fight against Brexit. So you and I share a lot in common of the analysis of how bad this is for our economy and for our security, as you rightly pointed out. But let me be clear. Liberal Democrats will read the deal. We'll treat it with respect. But I don't think it's reasonable to ask us to vote for a deal that is a bad deal for our country. And I repeat, we're in a crisis for our country, a health crisis, a jobs crisis. We need a deal that's going to help people, help businesses that are in such dire straits. And if we had a responsible prime minister who was putting the country first, where he finds it, not just appealing to ideological Brexiteers, then I really think he would be trying to make sure they're not putting barriers up to trade, barriers up to creating jobs. And we will treat the deal seriously, but we'll measure it in those terms.
Amber, and I'll come to you, Claire.
I mean, Ed, you know there's no third deal. There's going to be either a deal, which is, by your definition, a bad deal and you won't vote for it, or no deal. So you may wish for a third deal, which would be positive. It just doesn't exist.
I don't accept that. No deal is always avoidable. Liberal Democrats have led the fight against no deal. Everyone knows that. Right. The EU don't want a no deal. All they need to do is pick up the phone to Barnier or to Ursula von der Leyen and say, look, give us an extra extension to transition. We'll negotiate a better deal for everybody. Okay. It's in everybody's interest, and the EU would play ball with that.
I'm going to bring in the others, Claire.
I feel as though I'm in a time warp. That's the first thing.
I think you're alone.
And the other thing, Ed refers to ideological Brexiteers, accommodating them. I think it might be called the voters, and the voters.
But there was a split amongst Brexiteers. Let's be honest, and within the Tory party, that's true.
Let's be honest. The Tory party is not the only Brexit bit. So when you think about the last election, the people who voted for the Tory party were actually often Labour voters, Red Wall, etc., etc. And what did they vote for? They voted so they didn't have to listen to Amber and Ed trying to stitch up behind the scenes that Brexit was, they've decided all about the economy, so terrible they'd do as little as possible to honour it. And so we're now in this situation. But Ed made one point very importantly when he said, we will read and study this deal and decide whether it's a bad deal or not. Well, he won't have much of a chance because none of the rest of us will. Because what is now going to happen, as we all know, is we're going to get a deal thrown, I think pretty sure we will, be given hundreds of thousands of pages, and those of us who actually do not want a bad deal and would be prepared to have a no deal, although that's living on WTO terms, it's not, as Amber described, going to lead to absolute chaos. Regardless of what you think of that, none of us have got time to...
you think?
It's a disruptive mechanism, no matter which way you go. Yeah. The point is, accountability and scrutiny, which is partly what Brexit is about, are being denied to the voters and parliamentarians because they won't have time to study it.
Right.
That is a problem. I prefer to leave with no deal than that.
Amber?
Well, it's just, on this sort of altar of her true Brexit, and Claire has her own version of that, she's going to sacrifice so many jobs and so many opportunities for people. I think it's so sad. I also think, can I just object to her characterisation of a government that I was in, trying to do a stitch-up? That government worked incredibly hard to find a compromise. And given that Brexit was won by 52% to 48%, a compromise was the right outcome for this country. And I think it's sad that neither Labour nor the Lib Dems would support that.
Right. I mean, there has been here an example of old arguments being rehearsed again and repeated. I mean, in some senses, it hasn't moved on. But there were different views, weren't there, Chris? I mean, truthfully, even within parties and within Brexit or Remain.
Well, the idea of hard and soft Brexit was, I think, coined by George Osborne the day after the referendum in 2016. The problem with Brexit is you have to either do it or you don't do it. You can't be half in, half out, half divorced, half not divorced. And that's the problem. That's where Claire's coming from. I think the backbenchers are very worried right now about they'll have 2 days to scrutinise an 800-page document with annexes. What's in there? Will there be any betrayal, a Maastricht-style betrayal back in the 90s? That's what they were worrying about, and that's what Claire's talking about. And others are saying, I've talked to at least one cabinet minister last week who says WTO will be fine, really, because there'll be 3 weeks of upheaval. Then companies, businesses always find a way. It's what they do, and that's why we have a dynamic capitalist society here. So I hope this conversation might be confined to 2020 after this programme.
Right. Well, Ed, what do you want to say in response? What was that, Amber?
It's interesting about the cabinet minister who's briefing Chris there, because I'm not sure if he's talked to farmers who would see huge tariff rises if we go to WTO. I'm not sure he's talked to the automotive industry, which see a 10% tariff. A WTO-style deal would be an absolute disaster for our economy. Everybody knows that. That's why Liberal Democrats have always voted against a no deal and will continue to vote against a no deal. We think there's a real opportunity here If Britain and if the Prime Minister were to actually realise we're in an economic mess, let's work with our European partners, let's get a really good trade deal which doesn't put up barriers, doesn't put up bureaucracy to trade, then we can go forward. And what really irritates me about the Conservatives, they're trying to say this is a free trade deal. They're taking away free trade. This deal is the opposite to a free trade deal. It's why it's going to damage our economy.
It doesn't include services.
And I'm not sure the Brexiteers actually said that.
It doesn't include services. It's mainly a goods agreement, isn't it? And services, which most of the economy is not involved. That is the WTO exit on services, for example.
All right, we're going to move on from this particular part of Brexit and talk about something else, because a former Tory immigration minister, Caroline Noakes, in fact, had an urgent question, and this is in response to plans to house asylum seekers, as she sees it, in unhealthy facilities after Brexit. Here she is. Tory MP accuses UK Home Office of planning to house asylum seekers in the camps. Amber, plans were set out to ban asylum seekers from being able to make claims at sea from 2021. The new law would pave the way for UK Border Force vessels to intercept them and return them immediately to France. But Caroline Noakes thinks that rather than stopping people traffickers, it'll create a separate tier of asylum seeker who won't have their claim considered and there'll be no mechanism to return them by. And she says they'll be housed in camps with no mains electricity nor mains water. Now, the Minister, Chris Philp, actually says that the government provides asylum seekers with good accommodation and due to the very short-term pressures created by coronavirus, they've used hotels, but the department aims to phase them out as quickly as we possibly can in 2021. Do you share your former colleague's concerns?
Caroline Noakes was an excellent immigration minister and was one, I think, for longer, I expect, than Chris Philp has been. So I think she has raised valid concerns. The idea of housing people in a place where there is no access to electricity and water is not the country that we should be. So I would share her concerns. I haven't heard the debate, and I'm hearing about this from you for the first time, but I would instinctively support her on those concerns.
Chris? It must breach human rights rules. I mean, that can't possibly be allowed to not have any mains of water or anything like that. That can't be possibly even allowed, I'd imagine. And I wonder whether it's actually the case. We have had reports of pushing asylum seekers onto boats in a channel on an island in north of Scotland. I wonder where the truth of these stories lie.
But it is interesting because Caroline Noakes, as we have now heard, was an immigration minister. Amber says a very good one. Wouldn't she know some of the detail around this, Chris?
Well, it might have been an idea in the past. I just can't think that was done to any kind of scrutiny from the courts. That's why I'm surprised by it.
Ed, do you think this needs to be followed up?
It absolutely does. I mean, I didn't always agree with Caroline, but here we have a former Conservative immigration minister criticising her own government. I think that should make everybody sit up. I mean, the reality is, I think Priti Patel is one of the most right-wing Home Secretaries we've ever had, and her approach to immigration, approach to asylum seekers, is deeply illiberal. We should be treating people with dignity. We should help people in need. We should underscore and keep to our international responsibilities. And what's proposed sounds like it could be absolutely disgusting.
Right. Well,
and frankly, similar to Donald Trump with his immigrant policy at the US border. That is not fit for our country.
Right. I mean, this is a new policy, Claire, that is going to come into force in 2021. And this has been a very difficult issue to solve in terms of trying to deter people taking that dangerous journey across. We don't know because the government doesn't either categorically deny or confirm anything about no mains electricity or mains water when it comes to housing asylum seekers or failed asylum seekers. What's your view generally?
Well, my view generally is that it's a matter that needs to be tackled very urgently. The description of where they're being housed is ridiculously vile, inhumane, nothing good to say. Of course, people will contrast it to and they've been staying in hotels. I'm not of this is the most shocking thing you've ever heard story. But the truth is that coronavirus, COVID in particular, has meant that there's a certain out of control nature to the asylum seekers arriving. We haven't got a straightforward policy for dealing with asylum seekers. And that, you can understand, again, symbolically feels like as though people feel, well, what's the point in saying you've got an immigration policy if you then can't stop people coming here who shouldn't be coming here? I, of course, am on the liberal wing on this and would be more generous maybe in my attitude, but it is also true that there needs to be rules in relation to it, and therefore I think that asylum needs to be tackled. Right. I think having a go at Priti Patel just doesn't really even help in this instance. If the policy proves to be true, it is not fit for purpose of a sovereign country of any description, because you wouldn't treat animals like that and you shouldn't treat humans like that.
Ed?
Well, I'm afraid it's Priti Patel who's putting this forward. And she's on her
except, as I say, we don't know about those particular accusations. They were raised by Caroline Knox.
They were raised by a Conservative, not a Liberal Democrat. They were raised by a former Conservative immigration minister who will have extremely good contacts with people in the immigration service. So I accept that we don't absolutely know. Claire's right on that. But I'd have thought she would share my concern and my worry. And indeed, my colleague, Alistair Carmichael, who's a Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokesman, was also raising this issue very powerfully and getting no really good answers from the government. So we are going to hold the government to account for this. And I think people across parties want to make sure that we treat people with dignity and respect.
I think we all agree on that.
All right. Well, and on that rare point of agreement, we're going to move on and talk about the tier system, because the review has carried on overnight. And now we've had the announcement in the House and a statement from Matt Hancock. As we said at the beginning of the programme, very few areas moving down the tiers, a lot more going up, particularly in the South East, from Tier 2 to Tier 3. But let's get a flavour of the exchange in the Commons today.
It is therefore necessary to apply Tier 3 measures across a much wider area of the east and southeast of England, including Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, Peterborough, the whole of Hertfordshire, Surrey with the exception of Waverley, Hastings and Rother on the Kent border of East Sussex, and Portsmouth, Gosport and Havant in Hampshire. These changes will take effect from 1 minute past midnight on Saturday morning.
Yesterday, England reported over 23,000 cases, the highest numbers in a month. Hospital admissions on 14th of December were the highest since 16th of April. The number of people in hospital with COVID is now the highest since the 22nd of April. The number has risen 20% since the end of lockdown. If it goes up by another 20%, we are back at the same peak we saw in April. These numbers should be sounding all the alarm bells there are.
Is the tier system working, Chris?
Well, I think it is. I think there's a balance the government's trying to strike here between locking people down and seeing them break the rules and then having prosecutions and trying to guide them to do the minimum they're allowed to do looking into the Christmas period. I think they're going to try and buffer probably Christmas by having really tough Tier 3 and Tier 3 measures either side in England. I think it's very hard. I know that Boris Johnson, in his waters, is a freedom-loving Tory. He tells us enough. Even Matt Hancock told me the same for the Telegraph a few weeks ago. They don't want to do this, and that's what you have. You have this complete contrast and conflict in them about locking down the country when they want to let people party, but they can't. That's the problem. I think it is broadly working. If you look at the numbers in Wales, where they're much tougher on lockdown, numbers are going the wrong way there quite quickly. So I think it's a balance and it's the right side of where they should be.
You didn't support the government, Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrats, on the tier system. When you look at the figures now, do you think it's correct to move more of these regions into the top tier?
Well, Joe, let me correct you. We didn't support the way the government was doing the tier system. There has to be restrictions. That's absolutely clear because of the public health challenge. But the problem is the people out there, they're anxious and worried, and they see a prime minister who's giving confusing messages. He doesn't look like a prime minister who's got a grip. He doesn't look like a prime minister who's in control. And people were excited about their Christmas, and now they frankly don't know whether it's safe. And the problem is this is a story about the way this Prime Minister has behaved throughout the pandemic. He entered lockdown late. There was a mess over PPE. The test, trace and isolate system didn't work. It's always failed leadership. And we're seeing it again on the tier system. And no one's saying it's easy. Let's be frank. It is difficult. But if you look at a place like Wales, they seem to be making the balance, I think, a bit better.
Claire?
Well, Wales are not making the balance better. The numbers are skyrocketing, and they've had the most draconian rules, so that doesn't seem to me to work. I'm from Wales, and let me tell you, my Christmas has just been cancelled by Mark Drakeford, so I'm in a good mood on that question. The thing that I really think is important is that because we only see the harms and risks of COVID, and we are refusing to look at harms and risks of the way we are dealing with COVID by basically increasing tiers for everyone apart from Herefordshire, I think, and Bristol. That's it.
So Bristol's going from tier 3 to tier 2.
Bristol and Herefordshire is going to 1.
Right.
But, I mean, what I'm saying is everyone else has either stayed put or gone to... I mean, it's basically semi-lockdown. Tier 3 is devastating for livelihoods, for jobs. I mean, we've heard a lot of people weeping and gnashing about the potential to the economic damage of a no-deal Brexit, which I dispute. But one thing that's not disputed is that Tier 3 closes down not only civil society, but jobs and so on. But one thing that Boris Johnson did say at some point was he said tiers shouldn't be seen as destiny.
Yes.
We will change them if the numbers reflect that. Well, I can assure you that in the Northwest, the numbers have gone down and it hasn't changed. And despite what we heard from one MP there, I think it's important to also get a grip of the data. You know, lots of people are getting COVID in hospitals. Hospitals are the place where it's been caught most. Are we going to close down hospitals? No, we're not. So we have to understand that closing down pubs where they're not getting it is a bit odd. Then you've got a situation whereby more and more people are surviving it. Many people in their 80s are now catching COVID and getting over it. So,
well, where are you getting that data from?
Because actually, these data are coming out from hospitals and all of the scientists that the government quote. I mean, the other thing that I was just going to say was
let's be careful about where we're making sort of statistical arguments when we don't have that firm data.
That's absolutely fair enough. But I'm saying that having read, I mean, God, I spent all my time reading on this.
Oh yeah.
But the government's own statistics today also say that a lot of the deaths since excess deaths.
Yes.
Over 40% of them are not now considered to be COVID. That's the reality. People dying at home. That's today's figures from the government. And I'm saying that a lot of people are dying, potentially, because of the way we're dealing with COVID.
All right, but there are also figures that say, actually, that will have said that the majority of excess deaths have been as a result of COVID.
Yeah, but this is today's figures.
I accept that, but, you know, it's difficult to know exactly.
All I'm saying is, if you have a balanced conversation, you don't just look at one set of data.
Sure.
And I want there to be a public debate about what risk we're prepared to take, where we're grown up and adults, and where we can actually say, do you know what? Carrying on into not now, but carrying on into 2021, if all that we are reduced to as citizens is sitting on the couch waiting for Matt Hancock.
Let me bring the others in. Amber.
Thank you. Yes, I would be cautious about minimising the seriousness of this disease,
I'm not.
Claire. I mean, what we've seen, although we've learned a lot more about it, is some really terrifying stories about people being impacted and sometimes dying, particularly in the health service. The most important thing I think that we've learned this year is about the fact that it is communicated or transferred by contact. So your question, do tiers work, is they work up to a point, because the higher the tier, the less contact people have with other people. Therefore, the amount of contagion is necessarily reduced. But nevertheless, I think that people are nervous about Christmas, and right to be nervous, and there is confusing messaging going on, but I think it's the only way to handle it at the moment. I know that since those decisions were made about Christmas, that the number of people with the COVID virus has gone up. So that is out there, and then people are able to make their own decisions. I heard somebody compare it to the speed limit of 70 miles an hour. It's still 70 miles an hour, but there is a lot of ice on the road, so do not necessarily drive at 70 miles an hour if you can possibly help it.
Okay.
I think it's the right thing to do for now. But I think that just to observe, as we finish this year, still with the virus around us, the vaccine is an extraordinary outcome of the work that's been done this year. And the fact that we are starting to vaccinate is what's going to make next year so different from what it could have been.
All right, but Amber, how do you rate the government's performance in terms of competency at dealing with this pandemic when you listen to what Ed Davey said?
Do you know, I think it's too early to say. Even Ed fell into the trap of trying to compare the government's competency with Wales. Earlier in the year, it was compared to Sweden, as though Sweden was a great triumph. Turns out it's not at all. So I wouldn't rush to condemn this government for various moves it's made. I think there will be an inquiry at some stage, and then we'll be able to look back with perspective.
Right. I mean, in terms of compliance, do you think, Amber, that there is a problem with compliance, with people following the rules?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a problem with compliance, which must inform the sort of rules that are put in place. And one of the reasons I think probably that the government is not going to go back to Parliament and try and change the rules is they wouldn't get it through. A lot of Conservative MPs feel very strongly that there shouldn't be additional regulation because, not only do they, like Claire, believe in sort of making sure that there is more opportunities for people to make their own decisions, but also they just believe that there would be an issue with compliance.
Right.
Well, they would do. It's all on Labour again now, Amber, isn't it? If Labour abstain or unless they vote against, it will go through, won't it? Any other changes to these rules?
OK,
Possibly.
well, let's have a look at compliance, because your former colleague, Tory MP Tobias Ellwood, we can show this tweet here from journalist John Stevens, attended a Christmas dinner with 27 guests at a private members club in Mayfair on Tuesday. He said it was in accordance with business meeting. Amber, is that acceptable?
Well, I think that a business meeting is allowable. There's one of the confusions that is there. You can go out and have a business meeting. I think you're also allowed a Christmas party as long as there's sufficient spacing. So I think it's a bit of a grey area, so I wouldn't rush in to condemn him.
Right. Well, someone who has is Priti Patel, who's talked to ITN. She's your successor, of course, as Home Secretary. He's made Tobias Ellwood an egregious breach of COVID regulations. And I paraphrase here, and she's going to be following it up. Is that the right response?
Well, I would be cautious as a government to point out other people's failures when so recently the national joke was about Castle Barnard.
Claire?
I think that it is true that the rules are that you have 30 meetings
at a business meeting, which is what he says.
Business gatherings. It's not even meetings.
All right, a business event.
No, I know. That's the point, though. Therefore, it can be interpreted. It was just that I was more laughing at that. I don't think we should point the finger at people for breaking the rules when we've just had a government pointing the finger at people for breaking the rules throughout. Everybody seems to want to say the public are useless and are breaking the rules. On the compliance point, my point about personal responsibility, which I think is important, is if the rules don't make any sense. So I was saying about Wales, if the rule of a 6 o'clock curfew doesn't make sense, or the 10 o'clock curfew was, or people don't understand why, well, you can have a business gathering, but you're not allowed to go and meet your mum and sit in a cafe with her. Then what people do is they actually do use their common sense and try and negotiate sensibly. This idea that what people are doing is letting rip and killing granny. And, yesterday I live in Haringey, and the head of Haringey Council put out this horrible film, which is basically saying that people who go to the gym or for a cafe are murdering their family. He said it's like a weapon of choice. I just think, couldn't the misanthropy leave the room, please? If we're going to have social solidarity and appeal to people to stick sensibly to precautions, you have to give them a sense of responsibility, not threaten them with the law if they make slight mistake or something.
Let me agree with Claire on one thing. Some of the rules and restrictions haven't made sense, and the people, therefore, haven't had trust in them. To give you an example from a few months ago, the 10 p.m. curfew on pub openings, when people were allowed to go to the pubs, really didn't make sense. It didn't even make sense in public health terms, and that's why the Liberal Democrats opposed it. So we have to look at every aspect of the regulations the government putting forward and criticise them properly. But if we're talking about compliance, I think we have to have a bit of honesty here. The biggest mistake, and it's shown in all the opinion polls, was when Dominic Cummings did go to Barnard Castle and to Durham and clearly broke the rules, and the government and the Prime Minister did nothing. And that message, that was one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us, was one of the big moments of this pandemic when the government got it wrong and it undermined public confidence and public trust. And they've not really rebuilt that. And one of my problems, one of my big criticisms of this government is by not really realising that in the messaging, in your own actions, you need to build that trust so people do comply. And the other thing that they've done wrong is they've centralised thing. If you have more local involvement, you're going to have more compliance.
All right. And what about that, restoring trust after the Barnard Castle and Dominic Cummings incident?
It's certainly required, and it was odd to a lot of people watching that play out since the summer why Boris Johnson didn't act quicker and see what damage it was doing to his government. I would ask Ed about the Lib Dems. Back in the day, back in the noughties, the Lib Dems were quite a anti-Big Brother state, anti-CCTV, anti-rules, a kind of liberal Democrat party. I wonder why you seem to be falling into line with Labour so much. You're not really differentiating properly in the House. I wonder why can't you be more out there as a freedom-loving party?
Liberal.
As liberal possible.
I would disagree with that. We have, for example, fought the 10 p.m. curfew. Daisy Cooper was the lead MP fighting that restriction because it didn't make sense in public health terms. The real problem, I think, is we want to trust the people. The problem is the people don't trust the Prime Minister because of his many failings.
All right.
The lack of public confidence in the Prime Minister has created that difficulty, Christopher. I think you can admit that.
All right, let's move on because we're going to talk about the news that's here in the Daily Mail in one newspaper. Heathrow third runway will go ahead. Airport wins Supreme Court challenge after High Court had ruled expansion would be illegal. Just to get your response, good or a bad thing, Claire?
It's a brilliant thing. It's a real shame that regulations around COVID means that there's hardly any planes flying. But this is part of a modern world. It should always have gone ahead. And I'm delighted a bit of progress and positivity for the future.
Is that how you see it, Ed?
Not at all. We're about to be the host for the UN's climate change talks next year. And if you expand Heathrow, you're expanding the biggest source of emissions for the future. And Claire's right on one level, people aren't flying. And I think in the future, we're going to see much less international flight because people are going to do business over Zoom, over all those other video conferencing platforms we got used to. And surely that's a good thing. That's modern technology. That's the future. So enabling people to do business across the world, very excited about that, but without damaging our planet. And we have to wake up. We have a climate change emergency. Liberal Democrats have been banging on about these. This Conservative government has taken the policy backwards. When Amber Rudd and I were working very well together, really expanding renewables, making Britain the world leader in offshore wind, Boris Johnson was criticising us. And I'm really worried. I don't trust him on this agenda. And if he doesn't do what he said on Heathrow, no one will trust him at all.
Right, well, Amber, on that point, the courts haven't saved Boris Johnson from the bulldozers. So what's he going to do? Who is going to save him from it?
Well, I hope it will go ahead.
The bulldozer or
the third runway, Heathrow. I think, I'm with Claire on this one. I think it's absolutely essential that the UK, particularly after Brexit, which I think will damage the UK's brand, is able to demonstrate what Boris Johnson calls global Britain and is able to show that we can expand our airport capacity. But I would also observe that I think we can do it in keeping with the Committee on Climate Change requirements to continue to reduce our net emissions as a country while expanding it. And one of the ways we can be confident about doing that is by observing about the extraordinary increase in renewables over the past 5 years, an extraordinary improvement in tech to be able to deliver on that, and the work that's going into aviation as well, with its net zero aviation fuel plan the government has. So I think we must try to have both these things, a big expansion of airport capacity and reducing our emissions. And the way the technology has moved to deliver that over the past 5 years shows it can be done. When Ed and I worked together, which we did in the coalition, solar panels, offshore wind were hugely expensive compared to where they are now.
Ed?
Well, listen, I think Amber's wrong on this. We need that expansion of renewables. I'm really proud of the role that Liberal Democrats played, and I've worked with Amber on it, as I've said. But, the climate emergency is so big, we can't expand air flight unless and until we get the zero carbon flight that Amber mentioned. Now, what Liberal Democrats have been saying is, let's use this economic crisis as an opportunity to invest in the industry of the future. And Britain has a massive aerospace industry with jobs all around the country. Why isn't the government developing a very strong partnership so Britain can lead the world, just as we now do in offshore wind, lead the world in zero carbon flight? And if we did that, if we could make sure that flight wasn't harming our planet, then I'd be with everybody else on having more capacity.
OK.
But until we do, I think it's wrong to press ahead.
Well, let Amber respond and then I'll come to Claire. Amber?
Well, I just don't think it's one or the other. We can address the climate emergency, and this government is taking that clearly very seriously. But we also need to look after the business expansion and the international flights that are needed with those. We can do them together in parallel.
Right. Claire, you welcome this. In fact, you think it'll be marvellous for Britain. But actually, the Committee on Climate Change, the official watchdog, has said if Heathrow expansion goes ahead, regional airports, some of them would have to restrict flights or perhaps would have to close. Now, you also want to see some investment continuing in other parts of the country outside of the capital, and yet they will suffer if we're to hit that target set by the Paris Agreement.
But that's the problem, you see. The target set by the Paris Agreement effectively means restraint. It means less. It means accepting a kind of form of austerity. Actually, it's been funny. Since I've been in the House of Lords, I mean, you have a certain view of what the House of Lords will be like. Anyway, I've discovered that they're all absolutely green to the gills. I mean, I've never heard so many speeches about the economy. It's like being in a...
Are you struggling to cope with them all?
It's like being in a kind of Extinction Rebellion meeting. The reason I'm saying it is because I actually think that we need to query the way that we're dealing with the climate change question. And that means about our priorities, because you just mentioned the North.
Yeah,
I want
regional airports,
growth. Yes, but I want growth. I don't want it to be like you can't have an international airport in Heathrow or Manchester suffers, because it's only because of an artificial imposition of a target that makes that.
Well, funnily enough, you've provoked a response here. Ed and then Amber.
You can have green growth, Claire. When I was Secretary of State of Energy and Climate Change, we got a lot of investment in renewables, and we did that through the supply chain as well. So we're getting jobs in regions of the country. Let me give you a classic example. We managed to persuade Siemens UK with a port company to invest in Hull. And in that investment in Hull, we got a new factory, a manufacturing facility, manufacturing the wind turbines for the North Sea offshore wind farms. It created 1,000 direct jobs. It's really helped to rejuvenate the economy of Hull. And this is a way we can rebuild. It's not a constraint on that. It's not holding back the regions. Far from it. This is a way of expanding growth out of London, out of the southeast, and making sure every region of our country can grow into a new future.
All right. Well,
arguing for the green recovery programme.
All right, well, let me get Amber's response, because, Amber, would you be prepared to see a restriction on flights at regional airports then?
But the Paris Climate Agreement was not about restraint. Claire is wrong there. It was about expanding in a different way, being able to expand while reducing our carbon emissions. And we can do that. And I think that it is perfectly reasonable to look at expanding rail rather than air. There's, the French have taken that approach, and as part of Macron's subsidy for the travel industry during COVID, he has put additional support into the rail sector and limited it for regional airports. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach. You can continue to grow a sector, grow the business, grow the connectivity without having regional airports, but have train travel instead.
Right. Can I just bring up COP26? In fact, I think Ed mentioned it, Chris, because Alok Sharma, the business secretary, is going to be in charge of it. There has been some concern that he's doing too much.
Well, certainly chairing COP26, I think they've been tapping up Tory grandees who might try and do it for them. I think Theresa May, David Cameron, maybe even Amber Rudd might be in.
And remind us what it is. Sorry, I shouldn't call it
COP26. Of course, it's this big UN conference, a massive conference in Glasgow this autumn, when the UK is hopefully going to deliver on the promise of lots of Boris Johnson's recent pledges, his 10-point environmental plan last week. So I wonder whether Amber's been asked to do it.
Amber?
No, it is a huge opportunity, and I think Alok can do a fantastic job.
Oh, you do? You don't think is this government not taking it seriously enough by making him do that as well as being business secretary?
I would rather he did nothing else but that. It is such a great opportunity for the UK.
You've made your point.
But you just illustrated my point. You'd think that the only thing that you can think about whenever there's a discussion about regenerating the North, any discussion on levelling up, anything about how we're going to absolutely kickstart the economy after the tragedy of COVID or the regulations associated with COVID that's closed down the economy and society, people say, let's have a green recovery. It's like mealy-mouthed. Why a green recovery? Just let's have a recovery. Let's not make everything about COP26. Let's have a bit more imagination than zero carbon, but actually go beyond just green jobs.
Amber?
I tell you, the answer to that, Claire, is because there is a climate emergency on. It's not a nice to have. It's an absolutely essential change that we need to have in the amount of carbon emissions that countries all over the world are emitting. We live with the consequences every day. This is going to be the warmest year on record. We need to take action. The UK can lead on this, and I want it to do so next year. It could do so if it takes the opportunity, and I hope that Alok Sharma will continue as president, but do nothing else. Nothing is as important as this.
All right. Well, Ed, you've been nodding away in agreement. Final word from you.
I led the UK delegation to 3 of these climate change talks and saw 3 presidents of those hosts. It is a massive job. And it is so important. We have a chance to change the future, to make sure we have a prosperous and green future.
Okay.
And I don't believe Alok Sharma can do that while dealing with the problems that businesses are going to face post-Brexit, with the pandemic, with unemployment forecast to rise by 1 million in the next 6 months.
All right. Thank you very much to both of you. We're coming back into the studio now as we close the show, because that's all from me this year. Thank you to all of our guests, to Chris and Claire too. But if MPs are recalled to Parliament next week, Adam Fleming will be here at the earlier time of 11:30 with all the latest in the meantime. And from all of us here, it's Merry Christmas. Bye.
They went in as ordinary people and they emerged as bigger stars than Hollywood royalty.